Today is our training session about other registrations, in registration and certification segment, in capital flow. Our service, our experts will help you in providing services to the people to easily start and grow their business in other registrations from labor registration to PF registration. We at Other Registrations we provide following services: labor registrations, ESI registration, PF registration. Labor Registration. Labor Registration Act is a state-specific law which varies from state to state. Most of the state governments have passed their own law through the legislature assembly, or some other state government have adopted legislation on Shops and Establishment Act. We are providing professional services in the matter of registration of the establishment and compliance with various provisions which may be required under respective Shops and Establishment Act. Labor registration. Different types of acts for labor registration: Shops and Establishment Act, Contract Labor Act, Building and Other Construction Workers Act. Principal Employer Registration under Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. License to a contractor for employing migrant workers under Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. Motor Transport Workers Act. Shops and Establishment Act. When an entity employs people who may be casual workers, full-time employees, contract-based etc. to regulate the work conditions and ensure the workers' rights are protected, it is mandatory to get registered under the Shops and Establishments Act, informally called shop license. When license required, every shop and establishment needs to register itself compulsorily under this act within 30 days of commencement of work. As this is such a basic license, many other licenses require this as proof of a commercial business. For example, most of the banks will require you to furnish it if you want to open a current account. Who are eligible? Individuals running a shop or having an office or place where they are carrying out business activity. All entities having an office and/or branch where any commercial activity is being carried out. Checklist. Name board. Photograph of the particular shop or establishment. List of employees. Copy of rental deed or sale deed of the particular shop or establishment. ID proof of the employer. 1 passport size photograph of the employer. Certificate of incorporation. Memorandum and articles of association in case of companies. Details of employees and their wages in Excel sheet. Important points. Objective. Every Indian state has enacted certain rules and regulations with regard to conditions of work. The objective is to secure uniform benefits for employees working in different establishments, from shops, commercial establishments and residential hotels to restaurants, theaters and other places of public amusement or entertainment. Records to be maintained. Under the Shop and Establishment Act, every business has to seek approval from Department of Labor and keep up-to-date registers regarding details of employment, fines, deductions and advances, salaries and holidays. Timeline: 15 days from the date of submission of application. Contract Labor Act. The Contract Labor, Regulation and Abolition Act has been enacted by the Indian legislature from the year 1970. The Act intends to prohibit the employment of contract labor in certain circumstances and to regulate the working conditions of contract labor during employment. Every establishment which proposes to employ contract workers for its work is required to obtain a certificate of registration from the appropriate government. A contractor is a person who takes over the responsibility to produce a given result for the establishment, other than a supply of goods or services of manufacture to such establishment, through contract labor, or the person who provides contract labor for any work of the establishment, and includes a subcontractor. Applicability and not applicability. The Contract Labor, Regulation and Abolition Act applies to the following entities: It applies to any establishment in which 20 or more workmen are employed on any day of the accounting year as contract labor. It applies to any contractor who employs or who employed 20 or more workers on any day of the accounting year. Also, it does not apply to the establishments if any work performed in the intermittent nature. It does not apply to the establishments if any work not performed for more than 120 days in a year. It does not apply to the establishments situated in the Special Economic Zone, SEZ. It does not apply to the establishments if any work performed in the seasonal nature for more than 60 days in a year. Checklist. List of contractors including the following details: name and address of the contractor, nature of work, number of contract labor engaged, date of commencement of contract work, timeline, 30 days as from the date of submission of the application. Responsibilities of employer: to get the registration of the establishment, to retrieve the expenses involved from the contractor through bills payable, to engage workers only through licensed contractors. The notice showing the name and address of the inspector in the language of both English and local language, the rate of salary, date of payment. The principal employer has to choose a representative to be present at the time of disbursement of wages to the contract workers. It is the duty of such representative has to certify the amount paid as wages in the wage register. Report the details relating to contract labor when the inspector requires. To send the information relating annual return, Form 25. To licensing authority by 15th February of every year. To submit returns for each contractor within 15 days of start or completion of work. Form 6A. Responsibilities of contractor: to get approval from the employer, to obtain a license from the licensing authority, to submit the monthly printed bill to the firm for payment of the work done by him starting from the day of the month, to present the name of the inspector, wages paid and abstract of the act, to maintain muster roll, wages, deductions, overtime, fines, advance, wage slips, registers under Section 29, to provide welfare and health facilities such as canteens. If labor is above 100 members, restrooms has to be compulsorily provided and also drinking water, urinals, latrines, first aid under Section 19. To disperse the salaries in the presence of the representative of the employer. To distribute employment cards to all the workers by 3 days of the start of work. Building and Other Construction Workers Act. Applicability. This act applies to every establishment which employs, or had employed on any day of the preceding 12 months, 10 or more building workers in any building or other construction work. When license required, every employer shall: A. In relation to an establishment to which this act applies on its commencement, within a period of 60 days from such commencement, and B. In relation to any other establishment to which this act may be applicable at any time after such commencement, within a period of 60 days from the date on which this act becomes applicable to such establishment. Checklist. Details of construction workers. Nature of work. Date of commencement of construction work. Notice of commencement of building or other construction work. Timeline. 15 days from the date of submission of the application. Principal Employer Registration under Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. In this case, principal employer should get registration to employ migrant workers. Applicability. If an establishment employs 5 or more interstate migrant workmen in a day during the year, then this act will apply. Interstate migrant workman means a person for whom appointment by a contract is given in one state for employment in any establishment situated in another state. And also interstate migrant workman means any person who is recruited by or through a contractor in one state under an agreement or other arrangement for employment in an establishment in another state, whether with or without the knowledge of the principal employer in relation to such establishment. Checklist. List of contractors including the following details: name and address of the contractor, nature of work, number of contract labor engaged, estimated date of commencement of contract work and date of completion, phone number of each contractor, ID proof and address proof of the principal employer, timeline, 30 days from the date of submission of the application. License to a contractor for employing migrant workers under Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. In this case, contractor should get license for employing migrant workers. Applicability: if an establishment employs 5 or more interstate migrant workmen in a day during the year, then this act will apply. Interstate migrant workman means a person for whom appointment by a contract is given in one state for employment in any establishment situated in another state. And also interstate migrant workman means any person who is recruited by or through a contractor in one state under an agreement or other arrangement for employment in an establishment in another state, whether with or without the knowledge of the principal employer in relation to such establishment. Checklist: copy of certificate of registration granted to the principal employer, form number 6. Issued by the principal employer. Estimated date of commencement and completion of contract work. Copy of agreement or work order entered in between the principal employer and contractor. Joint undertaking both by principal employer and contractor stating for payment of notified minimum wages to the contract labor engaged by them. Timeline: 30 days from the date of submission of the application. Motor Transport Workers Act. Applicability: it applies to every motor transport undertaking employing 5 or more motor transport workers. Every employer of a motor transport undertaking to which this act applies shall have the undertaking registered under this act. An application for the registration of a motor transport undertaking shall be made by the employer to the prescribed authority in such form and within such time as may be prescribed. Where a motor transport undertaking is registered under this act, there shall be issued to the employer a certificate of registration containing such particulars as may be prescribed. Checklist: permit obtained for first vehicle from Road Transport Authority, ID proof and address proof of the employer, details of routes the vehicles will be operating such as source, destination, kilometers, etc. If more than 5 routes, then upload in a separate document. Timeline: 30 days from the date of submission of the application. ESI registration. ESIC stands for Employees State Insurance Corporation. ESI is a self-financing health insurance and social security scheme mainly established for employees earning rupees 21,000 or less per month. Enacted by the Legislature, Employees State Insurance Act, 1948, has introduced several schemes to provide various medical as well as cash benefits to employees and their family. As per the provisions of Employees State Insurance Act, 1948, it is mandatory for all the companies with 10 or more than 10 employees to obtain the ESIC registration. ESI is established under the Ministry of Labour and Employment, Government of India. Contributions of entities to the ESI. Whether it's an employee or employer, both are required to contribute to ESI to be eligible for availing the benefits provided under the scheme. The contributions made by them are as follows. Contribution of employees. Employees need to contribute 1.75% of their salary to the government. However, from 1st of July 2019, the ESI contribution will reduce to 0.75%. Contribution of employers. The total contribution from employers should be 4.75%, which is reduced to 3.25% from 1st of July 2019. For which establishments ESI registration is mandatory. The Act have enlisted above some establishments for which ESI registration is obligatory: shops, cinemas, hotels or restaurants providing services but not involved in any manufacturing activity, roadside motor transport establishments, newspaper establishments, medical institutions, educational institutions, private. Benefits of obtaining ESIC registration in India. ESIC was introduced to provide several benefits to the employees working under specific establishments. Medical benefits to the employee and his or her family members. Maternity benefits to pregnant women. Paid leaves in any year, if the employee has any certified illness lasting for a maximum of 91 days, then he will be provided with sickness benefits at the rate of 70%. If the employee dies during the working hour, then 90% of his or her salary would be given to his or her dependent every month. The above same applies in the case of any disability. Medical expenses for old age care, funeral expenses. Documents required for ESIC registration. Copy of PAN, copy of GST registration, if any. Form 1. Employer's registration. List of employees along with their date of joining and rate of salary. MOA and AOA of the company. Certificate of incorporation. Partnership deed. Applicable in case of partnership. Copy of Factory or Shops and Establishment Act registration. Latest bank statements. 2 passport-sized photographs. Declaration form of each employee. Copy of any other registrations as required. Digital signature certificate DSC. Class the second of employer. Important points. Every employer who falls in the certain categories as discussed above is mandatorily required to obtain the ESIC registration. An ESI code is a 17-digit unique identification number allotted to all the registered establishments and units. Employers need to apply for Form 1 within 15 days after the Act applies to the establishment or the unit. All employers who are having ESI registration required to file ESI returns half-yearly, within 42 days from the end of each half financial year. EPF registration. Employees Provident Fund, EPF, is a scheme that runs under the Employees Provident Funds and Miscellaneous Provisions Act, 1952. The EPFO, Employees Provident Fund Organization, is the concerned governing body which regulates the EPF scheme. EPF is more like a benefit offered to employees by the employer at the time of their retirement. Therefore, every employer who has 20 or more employers working in his or her organization needs to obtain EPF registration mandatorily. Both the employer and employee have to make PF contribution in an equal ratio. The total PF contribution made by the employer and employee should be 12%. The employer has to make a PF contribution of 12% of the basic salary plus earner's allowance and retaining allowance. An equal contribution is required for the employee as well. Eligibility criteria for EPF registration for employers in India. In order to obtain EPF registration, the employer must fulfill the criteria as listed above. The factory which contains 20 or more employees. For any other establishments with 20 or more employees or class of such establishments which the central government may specify through a notification in the official gazette. Any establishment with less than 20 employees has received a notice for compulsory registration for not less than 2 months. If the number of employees is less than 20, the establishment can also choose voluntary registration, but the deduction, in this case, would be 10%. Benefits of having PF registration. Pension coverage. Apart from employees' contribution, the employer too adds an equal amount of EPF, which is inclusive of the Employee Pension Scheme, AePS. Hence, EPF helps in saving the right amount of pension money. Covering financial risks. If the employee falls ill or die or retire, PF can help his dependents by covering the financial risk in such cases. Emergency fund. In case of any mishaps, weddings, or emergency, EPF can be of great help. Employee Deposit Linked Insurance Scheme. Every individual with a PF account can avail the benefits of this scheme. It requires 0.5% of the salary deduction. Single account. Even if the employee changes his organization, he or she can carry on the same account in other organizations as well. Long-term goals. The provident funds could result quite helpful if carried for the long term. It can be useful while buying a property, etc. Documents required for EPF registration: PAN card of the company or firm or society or trust, copy of the cancelled check, certificate of registration, applicable for partnership firms, proprietorship, LLP, private and public limited companies, partnership deed, in case of the partnership firm, PAN card of the directors or partners or proprietor, Class 2 DSC of employer, copy of Aadhaar card or voter ID card of the director or proprietor, MOA and AOA of the company, MOA and bylaws of the society and trust, certificate of GST registration, if applicable, first sale bill, first purchase bill of machinery and raw material, salary of the employees, date of joining of the employee along with the date of birth and father's name, list of the monthly strength of the employees count, name of the bankers and the bank's address. Important points. Apart from the employee's contribution to the EPF scheme, employers also contribute, which goes to the employee pension scheme, AePS. Therefore, if you hold a PF account, you will surely get it as a pension when you retire. The PF contribution rate for both employees and employers is 12% of the salary. The employer is supposed to contribute 12% of the basic wages in addition to earner's allowance and retaining allowance. However, if the employees' count in the organization is less than 20, then the PF contribution rate is 10%. Provident Fund payments and returns. Provident Fund is a social security system that was introduced for the purpose of encouraging savings among employees, so as to benefit them during the course of their retirement. Contributions are made by the employer and the employee on a monthly basis. PF contributions can only be withdrawn by the employee at the time of his or her retirement, barring a few exceptions. All employers having PF registration, then the collected PF contribution payment to be made to the government by 15th of each month. All employers having PF registration are responsible to file returns on a monthly basis. The filing of returns must be completed by the 25th of each month. Thank you for watching.